Let's take a look at some of the basic particle shaders now. And the first thing to understand is how to actually access the render trees for the particles. So if we select the cloud and go into render tree, you'll see we can actually get access to all the p-types belonging to that cloud through the selection widget. And it's actually on the p-type that we find the render tree. So the first thing you'll notice is we have the particle billboard with the particle shape node plugged in, and that goes into the p-type. So like most things in a render tree, each node contributes a certain effect. So let's start by looking at just the base node that's plugged in. So first of all, we have this particle billboard, and this essentially just creates a 2D card that is rendered flat. And a lot of times what you'll do is you'll apply a sprite onto that or add some noise and soften the edges, and that ends up creating the end result for the render. And you can actually end up cheating it and getting quite a bit of volumic effect by adjusting the billboard settings. So let's just take a quick look at what we can actually tune on the billboard. So first of all, the shape. You can adjust the actual shape of the billboard, so we can make them spherical. We can make them rectangular. Surface normal. This is a very important setting, and this basically can determine how the shading is applied on the actual billboard. So we can fake it and act like the normals on the billboard are spherical, and that ends up giving us that rounded look. So if we actually set the shape to circular with spherical surface normal, you can see we get kind of a volumic rounded look, and that actually ends up creating quite a bit of realism without resorting to volume shaders. We can also set the surface normal to billboard. In this case, we'll get a flat look, and you can see the realism is quite a bit less, but each mode kind of has its purposes for rendering. Let's just switch this back to square. We'll set this to spherical. Another trick that the billboard uses is adjusting the face direction. So what happens currently is that the billboards are always facing the camera. So as the camera moves around the particle cloud, the billboards actually rotate and face the camera. So in that way, it always looks like a full volumetric cloud, rather than when we come around, you see the flat card and the illusion is kind of broken. So we can actually adjust the face direction to face, say, the cameras and lights, the incoming ray, or actually use the particle rotation. And a good option to enable is to have the billboard rotation follow the velocity. So in this way, depending on the velocity of the particles, the billboards will rotate and kind of give a little bit more realism to the overall look. Lastly, we can specify a texture coordinate system. So this will basically determine how the UV mapping is applied to the particles. So we can have different choices between the particles' local space, the cloud's local space, or a world space. Planar is a kind of an individual coordinate on each billboard. And then we've got settings for burn and self-shadowing. So burn basically, as we have the billboards accumulate and lay on top of one another, what we can do is multiply their intensities and create this sort of burnt out look where they're actually at their thickest, where there's most overlap. And this is a further technique for kind of creating a volumic 3D effect with just using billboards. So we've got some additional shading settings that are fairly straightforward for plugging in different colors, global illumination. We have this one tab where we can automatically connect, say, a sprite node, a shape node, or a gradient automatically. So rather than doing it manually through render tree, you can just go on the actual billboard node and do that. In terms of base shaders, the particle billboard is one of the crucial ones and is used probably in 90% of the cases. We've got some more special effects ones. We've got the Blob one. And this basically approximates a sort of metaclay look. So it creates these kind of spheres that have a range of influence. And depending on the range of influence, they'll actually blend with one another. So you can see here, you can control the blending amount. So I can bring that up quite high and increase the blending. And as I increase the blending, it gets a bit more computationally expensive because it's trying to compute how to blend between all those different particles. But you can see the end result is this kind of nice, soft, blobby look. Let's bring that down just a little bit. So you can approximate almost kind of a liquid effect using the blending amount. If we go in the other direction, of course, we end up getting it kind of more globular and individual chunks, so we get more of a organic, chunky look there. We can control the blending mode using different kind of algorithms. We've also got the ability to specify the texture projection used, so spherical, lollipop, all these different modes to actually apply texture on the overall cloud. And just like the Billboard, the settings for burn and self-shadowing, we have a static blur option. And for those of you who used to use SI3D, this is very similar. Basically, what we can do is modulate the transparency based on the normal. So the more the normal is perpendicular to the actual camera, the more it'll create a transparent effect. So the end result is we get the edges with this nice soft transparency, and the faces remain opaque. So if we look at the alpha channel, you can see we get a kind of an interesting effect there. And that's a great way for adding increased realism and blending that into your composite. So you got some controls for the overall width and fall off there for static blur. And the last node we have is sphere. And this is a fairly straightforward node. It basically just renders spheres for each particle. You've got some controls to render both the front and back faces. We can render just, say, the back faces here. And so in this case, we're just kind of catching the highlights on the back faces. We can increase the burn there. And you can see in this case, we can kind of just catch all the highlights and comp that in on top as just like a backlit pass. And we've got controls for static blur, just like on the Blob, to soften the overall effect there. So those three are kind of the basic standard nodes, and those kind of determine the overall look of your particles. From there on, we refine it by using shape nodes and gradients and stuff. So I'll just plug the Billboard back in. And basically what we can do is use the shape node to kind of polish the look of the Billboard. So we can have some controls for modulating the transparency. We can add some noise in there. Underneath this, we're still rendering the Billboard, obviously, but you can see the particle shape node makes a drastic difference in the overall look. So let's just take a look at some of the settings on the shape that's creating this effect. So the first tab we've got is fall off. And basically what this does, it lets us make the edges of the Billboard transparent. And keep in mind the particle shape node can be plugged into particle sphere or particle blob, and it all has the same effect. So what I'm saying here for the Billboard applies to these other shaders as well. So the fall off is controlling the transparency as you reach the edges of the individual particles. So we can choose between a bunch of different fall offs, Gaussian, user defined. And they actually make quite a big difference in the overall look. So we can use a smooth fall off to find the start and end range. So have the centers more opaque and then start the fall off a bit more near the edges. Or we can do the opposite and make it start ramping into transparency right at the center. So that's fairly straightforward. We've got the shape tab. And this is basically how we can introduce patterns into the Billboards or the particles without resorting to using sprites or gradients or texture nodes. So right now we're using a turbulence effect. And you can see we've got controls for the turbulence set here to actually modulate the amount of noise and the scale of the noise. There's a lot of neat things here to play with. I'll basically leave that to you to look at. We can add the sine wave in, set the scale of the sine wave here to get different circular looks. Let's start beam pattern. It's fairly self-explanatory, but this is really interesting way to create special effects for more kind of custom looks. So let's just set that back to the turbulence. So you can kind of think as this kind of tree as your base node. And then from here, we can plug into the shape some more interesting things like the particle gradient and drive the gradient through different scalar inputs to actually modulate the effect. So that's a bit more advanced, and that's what we'll be looking at next. But this was just a quick overview of the basic particle shaders.